The shadows of respect. The hotel lobby gleamed under the crystal chandeliers as Janet Adams adjusted the mop handle, her muscles sore from hours of scrubbing the marble floors. She glanced up briefly to see the reflection of the immaculate space, the pride of the Winston Hotel. The name tag pinned to her uniform read Janet, but no one seemed to notice her name, much less use it. To them, she was simply the cleaning lady. "Hey, Janie," a voice barked, pulling her attention back to reality. A young man in a pressed suit leaned against the reception desk, his smirk wide and confidence brimming with condescension. "You missed a spot, right there by the fountain. Or maybe you're saving it for your next shift." Janet stiffened, her fingers tightening around the mop handle. Laughter erupted from a cluster of staff at the front desk. They were all impeccably dressed, their tailored uniforms reflecting the elegance of the Winston. Yet their words cut through the air, meant to demean. Janet's face betrayed no emotion, but inside, anger simmered. These weren't the first jabs she'd endured, nor would they be the last. "Careful now, Janie," added a woman in a navy blazer, one of the managers. Her tone was falsely sweet, her grin sly. "You don't want to trip over your sense of pride." The laughter crescendoed, echoing through the grand lobby. Janet straightened her back, her eyes fixed on the scuff marks she was tasked with removing. Her calm demeanor masked the storm raging within her, but her resolve was as polished as the floors she cleaned. These people had no idea who she truly was. Janet wasn't just an employee. She was the owner of the Winston, a legacy built in silence. Janet had purchased the Winston Hotel a year earlier, a culmination of decades of hard work. Starting as a receptionist at a modest motel, she climbed the ranks in the hospitality industry, learning every detail of the business. She had scrubbed floors, served guests, and managed staff, knowing that true leadership came from understanding the struggles of every role. When the opportunity arose to buy the Winston, she seized it, pouring her savings and soul into the acquisition. But Janet had made a deliberate choice to remain anonymous. She wanted to see how the hotel truly functioned, to witness firsthand the dynamics between the staff and how they treated one another. Her choice to work incognito as a cleaner gave her an unfiltered view of the culture within her establishment. The first weeks had been uneventful. Most employees ignored her presence, but as time passed, their indifference turned to open disrespect. At first, it was subtle, sideways glances, whispered remarks. Then, it became blatant. Today's mockery wasn't an anomaly. It had become a routine. Morning shadows. Janet arrived at the hotel before sunrise, as she always did. The locker room in the basement buzzed with quiet energy as the cleaning staff prepared for their shifts. She changed into her uniform and secured her hair in a tight bun, blending seamlessly with her colleagues. "Morning, Janet," greeted Mr. Harris, an older custodian with salt and pepper hair. His voice carried warmth, a rare kindness in her daily grind. "Good morning," she replied, offering a small but genuine smile. The camaraderie among the cleaning staff was her sole solace. They treated her as an equal, though none of them knew her true identity. Their struggles were shared, their resilience inspiring. Janet began her day with the usual tasks: polishing windows, vacuuming carpets, and ensuring the hotel's luster remained untarnished. But as the sun climbed higher, the air grew heavier with tension. The polished suits and crisp uniforms of the managerial staff brought with them an air of superiority. The first jab. Janet was mopping the grand lobby when the day's first mockery began. A young man with slicked back hair and too much cologne approached, his exaggerated gestures a performance for his peers. "Janie, you're really working that mop, huh? Careful, you don't want to wear out the handle," he quipped, earning snickers from his audience. Janet continued her task, refusing to dignify the remark with a response. Her silence only seemed to fuel their laughter. "Careful, Janie," chimed in the manager in the navy blazer. "That mop might be worth more than your paycheck." The words stung, but Janet's expression remained impassive. She reminded herself of the bigger picture, her mission to rebuild this hotel, to create an environment where such behavior wouldn't be tolerated. A quiet defiance. Later that afternoon, an incident in the banquet hall pushed Janet closer to her breaking point. A junior staff member had spilled coffee on the plush carpet. Instead of cleaning it up, he called for Janet, his voice carrying across the room. "Hey, Janie, over here. Chop, chop," he barked, waving dismissively. Janet approached silently, towel in hand. The staff member didn't even acknowledge her as she knelt to clean the mess. As she worked, her reflection in a nearby mirror caught her eye. She looked tired but resolute. This was her hotel, her legacy, and she wouldn't let these moments break her. "You won't be able to hide forever," she thought, her determination renewed. The breaking point. As the day wore on, the atmosphere grew more toxic. By evening, Janet found herself summoned to the staff room. The manager in the navy blazer stood at the center, her arms crossed, flanked by a group of smirking employees. "Do you even understand English, Janie?" the manager snapped, pointing at a shelf. "I said organize. What's so hard about that?" The room erupted in laughter, their voices sharp and cruel. Janet felt her jaw clench, her fingers curling tightly around the mop handle. She was moments away from losing her composure. "Are you done?" Janet's voice cut through the din, calm yet commanding. The room fell silent, the staff staring at her in disbelief. It was the first time she had spoken back. "Good," she added. "I have work to do." Without another word, Janet turned and walked out, leaving the stunned group behind. Her heart raced, anger and frustration boiling beneath her composed exterior. She knew the moment of truth was approaching. The question wasn't if she would reveal her identity, but when. The calm before the storm. As Janet finished her tasks that evening, the tension among the staff was palpable. Whispers and sideways glances followed her, a stark contrast to their usual indifference. The disrespectful laughter had ceased, replaced by unease. They couldn't quite place it, but something about Janet's quiet defiance unsettled them. In the solitude of the locker room, Janet sat on the bench, her fingers trembling slightly. She thought of the sacrifices she had made to own this hotel, the late nights spent poring over financial documents, the grueling negotiations. She wasn't just cleaning floors. She was laying the foundation for change. "They'll find out soon enough," Janet whispered to herself. And when they did, she would ensure they understood what true leadership looked like. Her time as just the cleaning lady was drawing to an end. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. Cracks in the facade. The morning after her quiet defiance, Janet arrived at the Winston Hotel with renewed purpose. The faint chill of dawn lingered in the air, and the streets outside were still quiet, save for the occasional hum of a passing car. She entered the hotel through the service entrance as always, her simple cleaning uniform blending into the backdrop of the bustling kitchen staff preparing for the day ahead. "Morning, Janet," Mr. Harris greeted her, his warm smile a small balm to her simmering frustration. "Morning," she replied, her voice calm, though her mind was already racing. Today felt different. Something was brewing, a tension beneath the surface that promised confrontation. Observing the cracks, Janet started her routine as usual, methodically scrubbing the scuffed marble floors of the grand lobby. The early hour afforded her a brief reprieve from the snide remarks and condescending laughter that had become her daily companions. She used the quiet moments to reflect on the previous evening, the tension in the staff room, and the stunned faces of those who had mocked her. As the morning progressed, the hotel came to life. Guests began trickling in and out, their luggage wheeled along by bellhops. The front desk staff, polished and confident, exchanged pleasantries with the guests while their smiles faded the moment the interactions ended. Janet noticed every detail, the forced courtesy, the way some employees barely acknowledged the cleaning crew, and the subtle hierarchies that played out in every corner of the hotel. These were the cracks in the facade of the Winston's polished reputation, and Janet knew they ran deep. The morning confrontation. By mid-morning, Janet found herself back in the grand lobby, cleaning the expansive windows that overlooked the bustling city streets. The light streaming through the glass illuminated every streak and speck, making her task meticulous. It was during this moment of focus that she heard the familiar, grating voice of the manager in the navy blazer. "Janie." The manager's voice rang out, dripping with condescension. Janet turned slowly, her hand still gripping the cleaning cloth. The manager stood at the center of a small group of staff, her expression one of barely veiled disdain. "Yes," Janet replied, her tone neutral. The manager pointed to a corner of the lobby where a small pile of debris had collected. "You missed a spot. I need this cleaned up now. We have important guests arriving. And this," she gestured dramatically, "is unacceptable." Janet nodded and made her way to the corner, her movements deliberate and calm. She crouched to clean, the faint murmurs of the staff's whispered commentary reaching her ears. She ignored them, her focus on the task at hand. But as she straightened, her gaze locked briefly with the manager's, and in that fleeting moment, something shifted. The manager's smirk faltered. Janet's calm, unyielding stare unnerved her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. A quiet revelation. Later that morning, Janet retreated to the staff break room for a brief moment of respite. The small, windowless space was a stark contrast to the grandeur of the hotel, its plain walls and mismatched furniture, a reminder of the division between those who worked tirelessly behind the scenes and those who basked in the hotel's luxury. She sat at the far corner of the room, nursing a cup of tea. The other members of the cleaning crew were quiet, their fatigue evident. Maria, a young housekeeper with wide, dark eyes and a nervous energy, hesitated before approaching Janet. "Janet." Maria's voice was soft, barely above a whisper. "Yes," Janet replied, her gaze steady. Maria shifted nervously, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "I just wanted to say thank you." Janet frowned slightly. "For what?" "For standing up to them yesterday," Maria said, her voice trembling. "I've been here for 2 years, and they've always treated us like we're invisible, like we don't matter. No one's ever spoken back to them before." Janet's heart tightened. She had suspected the mistreatment extended beyond her own experience, but hearing it confirmed brought a pang of sadness. She reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Maria's shoulder. "You matter, Maria," Janet said firmly, "and things will change. I promise you that." The brewing storm. The afternoon brought more tension as whispers about Janet's defiance spread among the staff. The front desk clerks, who usually ignored her, now stole glances in her direction, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. The manager, visibly flustered, made several unnecessary trips through the lobby, her movements sharp and her demeanor more abrasive than usual. By the time Janet returned to the locker room to retrieve supplies, the atmosphere among the cleaning staff had shifted. They were quieter than usual, their usual camaraderie dampened by the palpable tension in the air. "Be careful, Janet," Mr. Harris warned her, his voice low. "They don't like being challenged, and they'll be looking for a way to make an example of you." Janet nodded, her resolve unshaken. Let them try. A catalyst for change. The turning point came later that evening when Janet overheard a heated argument in the kitchen. She was finishing up her cleaning duties in the banquet hall when raised voices caught her attention. Curious, she followed the sound, her footsteps quiet on the tile floor. The head chef, a towering man with a booming voice, stood at the center of a small group of kitchen staff, his face red with anger. "I don't care what she said," he roared, slamming a pot onto the counter. "I run this kitchen, and no one, especially not some cleaning lady, is going to tell me otherwise." Janet froze in the doorway, her heart pounding. The tension in the room was thick, the staff's fear palpable. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. "What's going on here?" Janet asked, her voice calm but firm. The head chef turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "This doesn't concern you, Janie. Get back to mopping floors." Janet didn't flinch. "It does concern me," she replied evenly. "I won't stand by while you treat the staff like this." The room fell silent, the weight of Janet's words hanging in the air. The head chef glared at her, his hands clenched into fists. But before he could respond, one of the younger kitchen staff spoke up, her voice trembling. "He won't let us take our breaks," she said, her eyes darting nervously between Janet and the chef. "He says we're lazy and don't deserve them." Janet's jaw tightened. She turned back to the head chef, her expression steely. "That's against labor laws," she said, "and it won't happen again." The head chef sneered. "What are you going to do about it? You're just the cleaning lady." Janet met his gaze, her calm unshaken. "We'll see." The gathering storm. As Janet left the kitchen, her mind raced. The head chef's behavior was unacceptable, and she knew it was time to take decisive action. She couldn't remain silent any longer. The staff deserved better, and she was determined to ensure they got it. That night, as she prepared for the next day, Janet knew she was no longer just observing. The time for change had come, and she was ready to fight for the legacy she had worked so hard to build. The truth begins to unravel. The Winston Hotel was abuzz with activity as the sun crept above the city skyline. A high-profile corporate group had booked the grand ballroom for a conference, and the staff were scrambling to prepare. The polished marble floors gleamed under the chandeliers, the rich aroma of fresh coffee wafted from the banquet hall, and a steady hum of voices filled the air. Janet was in the lobby, quietly polishing the intricate brass accents on the reception desk. She could feel the weight of curious stares from the front desk staff. Since her confrontation with the head chef the night before, whispers about her had intensified. The staff didn't know the full truth, but they could sense something was different about her, a quiet strength that didn't fit the image of a mere cleaner. As Janet worked, Maria approached hesitantly, her expression a mix of concern and urgency. "Janet," Maria whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "I just heard the manager and the head chef talking in the office. They're planning something." Janet straightened, her grip tightening on the cloth in her hand. "What did they say?" Maria hesitated. "They're meeting with the board tomorrow. They're trying to convince them you're unfit." Janet's stomach twisted, though her expression remained calm. "Thank you, Maria," she said softly. "I'll handle it." The cracks widened. Janet spent the rest of the morning moving through the hotel, observing the staff and noting the subtle shifts in behavior. The front desk clerks, who had once openly mocked her, were now noticeably subdued. The housekeeping team, emboldened by her quiet defiance, offered her small smiles of solidarity as she passed. But not everyone was pleased with the changes. The head chef, embittered by his public humiliation the night before, was particularly hostile. When Janet entered the kitchen to check on the banquet preparations, she found him barking orders at the staff, his tone sharper than usual. "Janie," he snapped as soon as he spotted her. "Shouldn't you be cleaning toilets or something? Leave the real work to the professionals." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Janet. She met the chef's glare, her expression unyielding. "Is that how you speak to your colleagues?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The chef scoffed. "Colleagues? You're a cleaner. You're not even in the same league as the rest of us." Janet took a step forward, her gaze steady. "Respect is not determined by your title. It's earned by how you treat others." The chef's face reddened, but he said nothing. Janet turned to the rest of the kitchen staff, her voice carrying across the room. "If anyone feels they're being mistreated, my office is open. No one here should feel afraid to speak up." As she left the kitchen, she could feel the shift in the room. The staff's gazes followed her, filled with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. The head chef might have been seething, but his authority had been visibly weakened. A silent ally. Later that afternoon, Janet retreated to her small, hidden office to prepare for what was coming. She knew the meeting with the board was a critical moment, and she needed to ensure she had everything in place to counter the manager and the head chef's accusations. Her office was modest, a far cry from the luxurious executive suites reserved for high-ranking staff. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, and her desk was cluttered with financial reports, employee performance evaluations, and guest feedback forms. As she reviewed the documents, a knock on the door startled her. "Come in," Janet called. To her surprise, it was Mr. Harris. The older custodian stepped inside, his weathered face serious. "Janet," he began, his voice low. "I've been working here for a long time, and I've seen a lot of things, but I've never seen anyone stand up to those two like you have." Janet smiled faintly. "Thank you, Mr. Harris, but I'm just doing what needs to be done." He nodded. "I just wanted you to know. If you need support, you have it. From me, and from a lot of the others." Janet's heart swelled with gratitude. "That means more than you know," she said sincerely. A prelude to war. As evening fell, Janet's thoughts turned to the upcoming meeting with the board. She knew the manager and the head chef would pull out all the stops to discredit her. But Janet wasn't afraid. She had prepared for this moment, and she was ready to fight for her vision. In the staff break room, Maria approached her again, her expression anxious. "Janet, are you sure you're ready for tomorrow? They're going to come after you hard." Janet placed a reassuring hand on Maria's shoulder. "I faced worse," she said with a small smile. "Let them try." But Maria's words lingered in Janet's mind as she returned to her office to finalize her preparations. She reviewed every document, every decision she had made in the past 6 months. She knew she had done everything in the hotel's best interest, but she also knew perception could be a powerful weapon. The night was quiet as Janet left the office, the hotel's corridors dimly lit. She paused in the grand lobby, taking in the polished floors and the elegant decor. This was her legacy, and she would protect it. The calm before the storm. The next morning, the tension in the hotel was palpable. Staff moved about with nervous energy, their whispers filling the air. The board meeting was the talk of the day, and everyone knew it could change the course of the Winston's future. Janet arrived early, as always, and made her way to the boardroom. The long, polished table gleamed under the overhead lights, and the chairs were arranged neatly around it. She took her seat at the head of the table, her documents organized in front of her. As the board members filed in, followed by the manager and the head chef, Janet could feel the weight of their stares. The manager's smirk was firmly in place, but Janet could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. The meeting began, and the manager wasted no time launching her attack. "We're here today because this hotel is in crisis," she began, her tone authoritative. "Under Miss Adams' so-called leadership, morale has plummeted, and operations have been disrupted." The head chef chimed in, his voice dripping with disdain. "She doesn't understand how this hotel works. Her decisions have been reckless and damaging." Janet listened calmly, letting them air their grievances. When they finally paused, she spoke, her voice steady and commanding. "Thank you for sharing your concerns," Janet began. "But let's look at the facts." She presented her documents one by one. Financial reports showing improved revenue, guest feedback highlighting increased satisfaction, and records of her initiatives to improve working conditions for the staff. "Every decision I've made has been in the best interest of this hotel," Janet concluded. "The real crisis here isn't my leadership. It's the culture of disrespect and mismanagement that has been allowed to fester for years." The room fell silent as the board members exchanged glances, clearly impressed by Janet's composure and evidence. The manager and the head chef looked visibly shaken, their confidence waning. The turning point. By the end of the meeting, the board unanimously expressed their support for Janet's leadership. The manager and the head chef left the room in silence, their defeat palpable. Janet stood at the head of the table, her heart pounding with both relief and determination. She had won this battle, but she knew the fight wasn't over. The real work was just beginning. As she left the boardroom, Maria and Mr. Harris were waiting outside. Their faces lit up with pride as they saw her. "You did it," Maria said, her voice filled with admiration. Janet smiled. We did it. Together. And for the first time in months, Janet felt a glimmer of hope for the future of the Winston. Reshaping the foundations. The morning after her victory in the boardroom, Janet awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. The events of the previous day had sent shockwaves through the Winston Hotel, rippling through the staff like an undercurrent of unease and curiosity. But for Janet, it was a new dawn, a chance to reshape the very foundations of her establishment. As she entered the hotel, the usual chatter of the early shift staff quieted. Heads turned, some nodding respectfully, while others quickly looked away. The weight of her newfound authority was palpable, but Janet remained calm. She wasn't here to revel in triumph. She was here to lead. A morning of change. Janet began her day by addressing the housekeeping and kitchen staff in a meeting she had organized in the employee break room. The room, often filled with the quiet exhaustion of overworked employees, now buzzed with anticipation. Many of them had heard whispers of the board meeting and Janet's unexpected role as owner. She stood before them, her presence commanding but warm. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice steady. "I've asked you here because I believe it's time for a change. A change that begins with all of us." The room fell silent, all eyes on her. Some faces reflected hope, while others were marked by skepticism. For too long, this hotel has operated under a culture of disrespect and inequality, Janet continued. That ends now. From this day forward, every employee at the Winston will be treated with dignity and fairness. A murmur spread through the room, and Janet could see the impact of her words. She laid out her vision. Improved working conditions, fair treatment for all staff, and mandatory training to foster a culture of respect. She spoke of her plans to overhaul the hotel's management structure and implement policies that would hold everyone accountable for their behavior. "We are all part of the Winston family," Janet said, her voice softening. "And it's time we start acting like it." Maria, sitting near the front, raised her hand hesitantly. "Does that mean people like the head chef will be held accountable?" Janet nodded firmly. "No one is above the rules. Everyone, including management, will be expected to adhere to the same standards." The room erupted in quiet applause, a flicker of hope lighting the faces of the staff. For the first time in years, they felt seen and heard. The resistance. Not everyone was pleased with Janet's announcement. As she left the break room, the manager in the navy blazer intercepted her in the hallway, her face a mask of barely concealed fury. "Janet," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Quite the show you put on in there. You really think a few nice speeches are going to fix this place?" Janet met her gaze, unflinching. "It's a start." The manager's smirk faltered. "You're playing a dangerous game. You think the board's support will protect you forever. This hotel has a reputation to maintain, and frankly, I don't think you're up to the task." Janet's voice was calm, but her words carried weight. The reputation of the Winston isn't built on cutting corners or mistreating staff. It's built on excellence, something I intend to uphold. The manager scoffed and turned on her heel, but Janet could see the cracks in her confidence. The tide was shifting, and the old guard was losing its grip. A quiet victory. That afternoon, Janet made her way to the grand ballroom, where the corporate conference was in full swing. The polished space was a testament to the hard work of the housekeeping and banquet teams, and Janet wanted to ensure everything was running smoothly. As she moved through the room, a guest approached her, a tall man in an expensive suit, his demeanor commanding. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite. "Are you the manager?" Janet hesitated for a moment before responding. "I'm the owner. How can I help you?" The man raised an eyebrow, impressed. "I just wanted to say this is one of the best-run hotels I've stayed in. Your staff has been incredibly professional and accommodating." Janet smiled, a rare moment of pride washing over her. "Thank you. I'll make sure to pass on your kind words to the team." As the man walked away, Janet noticed several staff members watching the interaction from a distance. Their expressions ranged from surprise to admiration. It was a small but significant victory, proof that her vision for the hotel was already taking shape. The storm brews. As evening fell, Janet returned to her office to review reports and finalize the details of her new policies. She was deep in thought when Maria burst through the door, her face pale and frantic. "Janet," Maria gasped, barely able to catch her breath. "It's the head chef. He's in the kitchen, yelling at everyone again. He's saying you don't have the authority to tell him how to run things." Janet's jaw tightened. She had given the chef one last chance to prove himself, but it was clear he had no intention of changing. "Thank you, Maria," Janet said, rising from her chair. "I'll handle it." The kitchen was a scene of chaos when Janet arrived. The head chef stood at the center, his face red with anger, as he berated a young line cook. Pots and pans clattered as staff scrambled to stay out of his way. "This is my kitchen," the chef roared, slamming a ladle onto the counter. "No one tells me how to do my job, least of all her." Janet stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise. "Enough." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. The chef glared at her, his defiance unyielding. "You think you can walk in here and change everything?" he sneered. "You don't know the first thing about running a kitchen." Janet's voice was calm but resolute. "What I do know is that no one in this hotel, regardless of their position, has the right to treat others the way you do. Your behavior is unacceptable." The chef sneered. "And what are you going to do about it? Fire me?" Janet met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "Yes." The room erupted in gasps and whispers, the staff stunned by her decisiveness. The chef's face twisted in anger, but he said nothing as Janet continued. "Your contract has been terminated, effective immediately," she said. "Security will escort you off the premises. If you have any personal belongings, you may retrieve them under supervision." As security arrived to escort the chef out, Janet turned to the remaining staff. "This is a new beginning for the Winston. If you are willing to work with respect and integrity, you have my full support. If not, you are free to leave." The staff exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of relief and uncertainty. For the first time, they realized that Janet wasn't just talking about change. She was making it happen, a glimmer of hope. Later that night, Janet sat alone in her office, the weight of the day settling over her. The confrontation with the chef had been draining, but it was necessary. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Maria and Mr. Harris stood in the doorway, their faces lit with cautious smiles. "We just wanted to say thank you," Maria said softly, "for everything you're doing." Janet smiled, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "Thank you. But this is just the beginning. We still have a long way to go." Maria nodded. "We'll get there. Together." As they left, Janet leaned back in her chair, her resolve stronger than ever. The Winston Hotel was her legacy, and she was determined to make it a place where everyone, from the guests to the staff, could feel proud to belong. The cost of change. The aftermath of the head chef's termination sent ripples through the Winston Hotel. Word spread quickly, and by the following morning, it was the sole topic of conversation among the staff. For some, it was a long overdue victory. For others, particularly those loyal to the old regime, it was a sign of upheaval they weren't prepared to embrace. Janet arrived early as usual, her steps deliberate as she made her way through the hotel. The tension in the air was thicker than usual. The manager in the navy blazer and a few other senior staff were huddled near the reception desk, their voices low but urgent. They glanced in her direction, their faces tight with barely concealed animosity. She ignored them, focusing on the tasks ahead. There was no time to waste on those unwilling to adapt to the new culture she was building. The morning's challenges. In the staff locker room, Janet found Maria and Mr. Harris waiting for her. Maria's expression was a mix of excitement and apprehension, while Mr. Harris looked as calm and steady as ever. "Janet," Maria began, "I don't know if you've heard, but the manager and a few others are planning to file a formal complaint against you. They're saying you're destabilizing the hotel." Janet's jaw tightened, though she kept her expression neutral. "Thank you for letting me know," she said. "I expected as much." Mr. Harris stepped forward, his voice steady. "They're desperate, Janet. They know their power is slipping. Don't let them rattle you." Janet nodded, grateful for their support. "I won't. But this only confirms that we're on the right track. Change always comes with resistance." As she left the locker room, her mind raced. The next steps were clear. She needed to address the complaints head-on and continue building trust among the staff. The first meeting. Janet's first order of business was a meeting with the remaining management team. She had called them together in one of the smaller conference rooms, deliberately choosing an intimate setting to foster open dialogue. As the managers filed in, Janet noted the mix of expressions: curiosity, skepticism, and outright defiance. The manager in the navy blazer sat at the far end of the table, her arms crossed and her smirk firmly in place. "Thank you all for coming," Janet began, her tone calm but firm. "I've called this meeting to address the changes we're implementing at the Winston. I want to be clear. These changes are not up for debate. They are necessary for the growth and success of this hotel." The room was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Janet continued, outlining her vision for the hotel and the steps she had already taken to improve operations and morale. When she opened the floor for questions, the manager was the first to speak. "With all due respect," she began, her tone laced with sarcasm, "do you really think firing key staff members is the best way to improve morale? You're alienating the very people who make this hotel run." Janet met her gaze, unflinching. "What alienates staff is a toxic work environment," she said. "Respect and professionalism are non-negotiable. Anyone who can't adhere to those standards will not have a place here." The manager's smirk faltered, but she quickly recovered. "And what about the complaints? Do you plan to ignore the concerns of the staff who feel you're overstepping your bounds?" Janet's voice was steady. "I'm addressing their concerns by creating a workplace where everyone is treated fairly. If that's considered overstepping, then so be it." The room fell silent again, the tension thick. Janet could see the gears turning in their minds. They weren't ready to embrace her vision, but they were beginning to understand that she wasn't going to back down. Small wins. Later that afternoon, Janet took a break to check on the housekeeping staff. She found Maria and a few others in one of the guest suites, cleaning and chatting quietly. When they saw her, they paused, their faces lighting up with smiles. "Janet," Maria exclaimed, "did the meeting go okay?" "It went as expected," Janet replied with a small smile. "But I wanted to see how all of you are doing. Any issues I should know about?" The housekeepers exchanged glances before one of them, an older woman named Rosa, spoke up. "Things are better, Miss Janet," she said hesitantly. "We feel safer now, like someone is finally on our side." Janet's heart swelled. "That's exactly what I want. If you ever feel otherwise, please don't hesitate to tell me." As she left the suite, Janet felt a renewed sense of purpose. The support of the housekeeping team was a small but significant win, proof that her efforts were making a difference. The storm escalates. That evening, an extreme event tested Janet's resolve. She was reviewing documents in her office when Maria burst in, her face pale and frantic. "They're meeting in the banquet hall," Maria said, her voice trembling. "The manager and some of the senior staff. They're trying to turn the other employees against you." Janet's stomach tightened, but she nodded calmly. "Thank you, Maria. I'll take care of it." When Janet arrived at the banquet hall, she found a group of staff gathered around the manager. The air was thick with tension, the manager's voice carrying across the room. "She's tearing this hotel apart. the manager said, her tone sharp. "We need to stand together and show her that we won't be bullied into submission." The staff murmured among themselves, their uncertainty evident. Janet stepped forward, her presence silencing the room. "Is that so?" Janet said, her voice calm but firm. "Because from where I stand, it seems the only bullying here is coming from you." The manager turned to face her, her smirk faltering. "This is a private meeting," she said, her voice wavering. "No," Janet replied. "This is my hotel, and I won't stand by while you sow division among my staff." She turned to the gathered employees, her gaze steady. "If any of you have concerns about the changes we're making, my door is always open, but I won't tolerate anyone undermining the progress we've made. This hotel is for all of us, not just a select few." The room was silent, the staff exchanging uneasy glances. Slowly, they began to disperse, leaving Janet and the manager alone. "This isn't over," the manager hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You're right," Janet said, her tone unyielding. "It's just beginning." A glimmer of unity. Later that night, Janet sat in her office, exhaustion washing over her. The day had been a battle, but it was one she was determined to win. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Maria entered, followed by Mr. Harris and a few other employees. Their faces were lit with quiet determination. "We wanted to thank you," Maria said, her voice soft but steady, "for standing up for us, for not giving up." Janet smiled, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "Thank you, but this isn't just my fight. It's ours. Together, we'll make this hotel what it's meant to be." As they left, Janet felt a renewed sense of hope. The road ahead was still fraught with challenges, but she was no longer walking it alone. With the support of her staff, she knew she could face whatever came next. The dawn of a new legacy. The final confrontation came swiftly, like a storm that had been gathering for weeks. By the time Janet arrived at the Winston Hotel early that morning, the air was electric with anticipation. Staff whispered in huddled groups, their conversations abruptly stopping whenever she passed. There was no mistaking it. Today was the day everything would change. Janet had prepared meticulously, spending the previous night poring over reports, correspondence, and legal documents. She wasn't just bracing for a fight. She was preparing to lay the foundation for a new era at the Winston, a legacy built on respect, integrity, and excellence. The manager's last gambit. By mid-morning, Janet was summoned to the largest conference room by the hotel's board of investors. The meeting had been called at the behest of the manager in the navy blazer, who had filed a formal complaint against Janet. The accusations were as dramatic as they were baseless. Financial mismanagement, staff unrest, and inappropriate leadership practices. The room was already filled when Janet arrived. The board members sat at one end of the long table, their expressions neutral but watchful. The manager and a handful of senior staff occupied the opposite end, their faces marked with smug confidence. Janet took her place at the head of the table, her presence calm and commanding. "Miss Adams," began the chair of the board, his voice measured. "You're aware of the concerns raised by the management team." Janet nodded. "I am, and I'm here to address them." The manager wasted no time seizing the floor. "This hotel has been in chaos since Miss Adams took over," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Staff morale has plummeted, key personnel have been dismissed without cause, and guests have started to notice the decline in service." She paused, casting a triumphant glance around the room. "This isn't the leadership the Winston deserves." Janet listened quietly, her face unreadable. When the manager finished, the chair turned to her. "Miss Adams, do you have a response?" Janet rose, her movements deliberate. She placed a thick folder of documents on the table, her gaze sweeping across the room. "First, let me address the claim of declining service," she began. "Here are guest satisfaction surveys from the past 6 months. As you can see, ratings have steadily improved since I implemented new staff training programs and operational changes." She opened the folder, distributing copies of the surveys to the board members. The manager's confidence faltered slightly as she glanced at the data. Second, Janet continued, regarding staff morale. Here are testimonials from employees who have benefited from the new policies. For the first time in years, they feel valued and respected. She passed out more documents, each one bearing heartfelt statements from housekeepers, kitchen staff, and maintenance workers. The room was silent, the weight of the evidence undeniable. Finally, Janet said, her voice unwavering, the dismissal of key personnel was not only justified, it was necessary. Allowing toxic behavior to persist would have done far more damage to this hotel than removing those who refused to change. The manager's face turned crimson, her earlier confidence evaporating. Janet turned to the board, her gaze steady. This hotel was in decline long before I arrived, she said. Under the previous management, guest satisfaction was at an all-time low, employee turnover was rampant, and profits were shrinking. I took over not to maintain the status quo, but to rebuild. And that's exactly what I've done. The turning point. The board members exchanged glances, murmuring quietly among themselves. Finally, the chair spoke. Miss Adams, the evidence you've presented is compelling. It's clear that significant improvements have been made under your leadership. He turned to the manager. Do you have any further evidence to support your claims? The manager stammered, her composure crumbling. I don't. But. Then this matter is settled, the chair said firmly. The board stands behind Miss Adams and her vision for the Winston Hotel. A ripple of relief and quiet applause spread through the room. The manager sank back in her chair, defeated. Janet remained standing, her expression calm but resolute. A new beginning. Later that afternoon, Janet called an all-staff meeting in the grand ballroom. The room was packed, the tension palpable as employees gathered, uncertain of what to expect. Janet stood at the front, her presence commanding as she addressed the crowd. Today marks the beginning of a new chapter for the Winston Hotel, she began. We've faced challenges, and we've made difficult decisions, but we've also made progress that will benefit all of us. She spoke of her vision for the hotel, a place where guests and staff alike were treated with respect and dignity, where excellence was the standard, and where every employee had the opportunity to grow and thrive. This is our hotel, Janet said, her voice rising with conviction. And together, we will make it the best it can be. The room erupted into applause, the sound filling the grand ballroom. Janet felt a surge of emotion as she looked out at the crowd, seeing hope and determination reflected in their faces. The manager's departure. The manager in the navy blazer resigned that evening. Her departure met with little fanfare. Janet watched her leave from her office window, a mix of relief and resolve washing over her. The old regime was gone, and the road ahead was finally clear. A glimpse of the future. Over the following weeks, the Winston underwent a transformation. Staff training programs were expanded, new policies were implemented, and the culture of the hotel began to shift. Janet made it a point to walk the halls daily, connecting with employees and ensuring her vision was being realized. One evening, as she walked through the lobby, she encountered Maria and Mr. Harris standing near the reception desk. They smiled as she approached. Things feel different now, Maria said, her voice filled with quiet pride. Better. Janet nodded, her heart swelling. That's because of all of you. This hotel's success is a team effort. As she stood there, surrounded by the people who had become more than colleagues, who had become family, Janet felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The Winston wasn't just a hotel. It was a testament to what could be achieved through perseverance, integrity, and a shared vision. The legacy. Months later, the Winston Hotel was thriving. Guest reviews were glowing. Employee satisfaction was at an all-time high, and profits had rebounded. Janet's leadership had not only saved the hotel, it had elevated it to new heights. Standing in the grand lobby one evening, Janet looked around, taking in the laughter of guests and the camaraderie of her staff. This was her legacy, a place where everyone, from the guests to the cleaning crew, felt valued and respected. The journey had been difficult, but it was worth every challenge. Janet smiled to herself, knowing that the best was yet to come. The Winston was finally what she had always envisioned, a beacon of excellence, built on the foundation of unwavering determination and a commitment to doing what was right.